During the climax of Skypiea, we learned that Enel was also responsible for destroying his home sky island of Birka just 8 years before the current story. But what if I told you that situation was actually not so simple? Now listen, I'm not trying to exonerate Enel here, he's definitely a bad person, but Oda has shown us a very clear recurring theme recently, particularly since the final saga began, where practically every time someone is blamed for harming their home country, it was actually because of Emu and the world government, thus framing them as if they hurt their own people. Loki is probably the most obvious example of this, where he was blamed for killing King Harold, but it was all just because Emu took him over. But Kuma is another one, where he was widely known as an evil tyrant, but he didn't even want to be a king in the first place. He just got a bad rep for taking down the Celestial Dragon's puppet in King Bakori. And how about Brook and Gunko, or should I say Princess Shuri, who Brook believes killed their king decades ago. But given the fact she's controlled by Emu as we speak, all signs are likely pointing towards the world government being involved there too. And I think you could even throw rocks in here as well, because while the events of God Valley have been widely hidden from history, Sengoku's version of the incident still painted rocks out to be a rampaging force of evil. But we know now that that was only because he was Domi reversied by Emu. And you know, God Valley was his homeland, and he was forced to attack his own wife and child, so it's a very similar thing even if the information isn't as public as the others. And we're pretty much seeing the same situation unfold right now in Elbaf, where the government is yet again making it seem like the people of a specific country have turned against one another. And all of these examples are things that we discovered just since Wano ended. And I think the purpose of this is because with us approaching the end of the story, Oda needs to really start showing us just how much Emu and the Gods Knights have had their hands all over the world's affairs, and ultimately how a lot of the characters that we already knew about have suffered from their actions as a result. So this all takes me back to Enel. Is he also being looked at unfairly or being misrepresented? Well, for reasons we're going to get to throughout this video, I'd say there is a very good chance. And I would also add that we have enough context now to know that what happened in Birka was probably a massive deal. Because while we haven't even seen the Sky Island Birka or learned literally anything about it yet, Oda did show us another place called Birka, which just happened to be a highly advanced city inside the moon where the Birkans originally came from over 1100 years ago. And with advanced technology kind of being the theme of the ancient kingdom, as well as more recent events in the story like the Mother Flame and Vegapunk, that tells us right away that Birka could have had a much bigger role than most of us are probably expecting. Not to mention the fact that the only supernova that we have yet to spend any meaningful time with yet in the story is my goat Urouge, whose design of his wings heavily hint towards him being a Birkin as well. And another Birkin that we know of, being Haradas, just became much more relevant in the story since the Vegapunks are taking punk records to Weatheria. Plus, you know, we did see what looks like another Ark Maxim on the Elbaf mural, and we haven't even seen the Heaven Realm yet, which reaches all the way to the sky. So it just feels like everywhere you look, Oda set things up for the story of Birka to come back in a major way, which is probably part of the reason why we have all of these very obvious parallels going on between Enel and Loki specifically, like how they both believe themselves to be gods, they both want to destroy some version of the world, and most importantly, they both even have lightning powers. I mean, this attack from Loki looks damn near identical to the one that Enel used in Skypiea. So wouldn't it be fitting if their pasts paralleled each other too, where they were both unfairly blamed for what happened in their home countries, which ultimately led them to becoming the type of people they are today? Well, interestingly enough, I think Loki's brother Harudin actually provides a massive hint that the giants had a direct connection to Birka themselves, because his helmet looks just like the Birkin's helmet that we saw from the moon mural. And I mean, that design is pretty unique, so I don't think it's just a coincidence. Perhaps this means he got it from there on a trip one time, or maybe someone brought it from there as a gift. And what's really interesting about this is that he even had this kind of helmet as a child, which was back around the time that Loki was born. The same exact time that Harold was venturing around the world trying to build relationships with outside nations. And this is crucial because because as we learned during the Loki flashback, that was one of the key parts to Harold's entire character, and specifically, he wanted to establish trade with these countries. So I don't find it to be a coincidence at all that Birka is also the name of the biggest trading city in real life from the time of the Vikings. That would, in theory at least, make Birka the perfect trade target. It would fit the Norse theme of it all perfectly, and I feel like we've been waiting for a connection between the giants in Sky Islands ever since we saw Giant Jack. A clear nod to the story of Jack and the Giant Beanstalk, a story where Jack climbs to the very top and finds giants in the sky. But to be fair, we didn't actually see Harold interact with any Sky Islands in the flashback. But since Oda also hasn't even shown us the Heaven Realm yet, which could very well provide easy access to Sky Islands via the Atom Tree, maybe even being the summit of High West as many theories suggest, I think we could easily chalk this up to something that he's just trying to save for later. And I mean, again, if one of Harold's kids really has worn a helmet from there for most of his life, that would probably tell me that Burka and Elbaf actually had to have a pretty close relationship. Maybe almost a little bit like King Harold had with King Neptune, which could actually be exactly where the world government comes into play too, because something that Neptune and Otohime shared with King Harold was that they all wanted to become allies with the world government, but they had a very hard time due to their race and history before they finally succeeded. And Harold actually wanted to join so bad that he even got rid of his ancient giant horns, which is an oddly nice parallel to Enel because he also removed his own Birken wings, which is something we'll talk about later in the video. So perhaps Birka was much the same way since they are also a unique race. However, in both Harold's and Neptune's cases, it didn't end up working out very well, as Harold had to end up being killed by Loki and Shirahoshi was almost kidnapped at the Reverie twice. But a fair point that some of you may be thinking right now is we haven't even seen the world government interact with the Sky Island before either, so how likely could all of this really be? And while that is true, we do have examples of the government interacting with literally each of the other sky races in a very significant way, except for the Birkens. And I think the biggest example of this so far is that the world government literally took over the Red Line from the Lunarians, who have almost now been wiped out completely. Now, we don't really know the full story of their race just yet, but they are a winged race, their wings even have the same design as the Birkens except colored black, and their name seems to imply some sort of connection to the moon. So like, would it really be a surprise if the government tried doing the same thing to the Birkens? And another case that we're aware of is that 800 years ago, the Shandorians fought a great war to protect the Poneglyph, which would likely be against the world government as that slides neatly into the Void Century. And while that island wasn't in the sky just yet back in that time, the Shandorians are at least a winged race who once resided on the moon with the Birkens. Plus, when Noland found the City of Gold in his flashback, his King of Loveneel contacted Marijwa about it. They had to get approval from them to do a second trip, but they didn't get it until that island already flew into the sky, which is some pretty suspicious timing if you ask me, but still, this is yet another sky race related connection. And so that covers the Lunarians, that covers the Shandorians, and what about the Skypians? Well, we kinda just have to recognize the fact that Saint Marcus Mars looks just like Gonfall, the former and current god of Skypiea. And Mars is also the warrior god of the environment, and we learned in Skypiea how important Verth was to the Sky people, something that Gonfall specifically told us about. So I think this tells us that there's definitely some connection between the world government and the Sky Islands. So based on all of this, I think the door's definitely open for Birka to have some sort of relationship with the world government, maybe even trying to join or successfully joining the Reverie at some point. However, something else we've seen is that when the government's considering letting a new country become an ally, they typically demand things from them. At a bare minimum, that would just be the Celestial Tribute, or in other cases, it can be the island's own natural resources, which is exactly what we saw at God Valley. And I think that situation deserves a second look here because 40 years ago, Garling visited that island to give them an invitation to join, which they refused, which led to them facing a cleansing just 2 years later. However, during that trip, Garling also met Shanks and Shamrock's mom, Magnolia, who had Shanks and Shamrock 39 years ago. And do you know who else is 39 years old in the One Piece story? Enel. Now, as I mentioned in my video on the other potential God's Knights orphans out there, I'm not saying this has to mean that he's Shanks' brother, but Garling's blonde hair does make you think twice about it. However, it could also just be that Enel was born from another one of the God's Knights who were on that very same mission, which would certainly explain his god complex, right? And you know, Buggy is also 39, so maybe he was conceived on the very same trip. But either way, this could maybe tell us that the world government visited Birka around this time. So that leaves us to then ask, what exactly did Elbaf via trade, or the world government via extortion, want from Birka specifically? Well, in order for us to answer that, I think we need to talk a little bit about what the Sky Island Birka was actually like. And since the place they all descended from, the moon city of Birka, was a highly advanced society, I think the odds are that the Sky Island version of Birka was also very futuristic. And something to back that up is the fact that the Birkans we do know of are very intelligent. Like, look at Haradas. He's already figured out how to manipulate the weather, which was Vegapunk's original dream back on Karakuri Island, which just makes the fact that Punk Records is headed there all the more relevant. And even Enel seems to be very smart because he played a role in creating and operating the Ark Maxim. Now, sure, the Skypian army was forced to build it for him, so it's not like he made the whole thing from scratch, but he also knew how to fix it after Sanji sabotaged it. And after seeing what looks like an old Ark Maxim on the mural, it seems that Enel probably got the designs from whoever made the original, a la Pluton and Galila, which will be important for later in the video. And Oda's even given us some very clear ties between Vegapunk and Birka, which have me wondering if Vegapunk could be like part Birkin or something. Like, for example, in Enel's cover story, we learn about somebody named Dr. Tsukimi, who is an old man from Vegapunk's home island of Karakuri that built his own little robot automata that were very similar to the ones already on Birka. Plus, the space pirate's Jolly Roger looked just like Vegapunk's head, which has to mean something. And then you add in Vegapunk's original goal of fixing the weather, thus tying him to Haradas, and even arguably Enel with the whole lightning power thing, plus, you know, the Ark Maxim made thunderclouds. There's clearly some important tie here between Vegapunk and Birka, whether that's the Moon City or the Sky City or both. And this could be why Oda's decided to have Vegapunk get cloned here on Elbaf sometime later. So maybe this hints towards Vegapunk actually being part Birkin, maybe not enough to have the wings, but enough to have their brains, because we do know that he was a natural born genius. It's not all about his devil fruit. Plus, mixed races have been a pretty big focus lately in the story, with the Buccaneers or Dosendadas, or even just the fact that Haradin wasn't allowed to stay in the castle, so maybe Vegapunk is one too. But he could have just lost the wings after so many generations, just like Chimney lost her fishmen features. And something that I think is worth considering about the Sky Island Birka being so advanced is that despite the moon holding 3 sky races, the Birkans, Shandorians, and Skypians, the other 2 races didn't seem to establish very advanced societies once they came to the blue planet at least 1100 years ago. In fact, the Shandorians were pretty much the exact opposite. They were basically tribal. They worshipped false gods, rejected all outsiders and any new kinds of science, and the Skypians were just like relatively modern. Sure, the dials and wavers were new cool instruments to us, but it wasn't necessarily something that you'd call high-tech. I mean, the dials came from the remains of certain shellfish in the White Sea. So these 3 civilizations almost create like a bronze, silver, and golden age paradigm, and with Birkans being shown with bigger wings than the other 2, I think that would tell us that they evolved separately from the other 2. So maybe the Birkans established the Moon City all on their own, thus why it's called Birka, I guess that makes sense, and then the other 2 races just arrived separately somehow. But with both Birkas eventually falling, I think it's kind of showing us that the more advanced you get, the more likely you are to suffer for it, which seems to be exactly what the Ancient Kingdom went through as well. And I think part of the reason that happens is that eventually bad people get in charge and make bad decisions with these very advanced weapons. It's kind of the same exact theme that we saw in Frankie's flashback with the Battle Frankies, and also with Vegapunk, York, and the Mother Flame, which then takes us to what Elbaf, or potentially the world government, would have wanted from them. And I actually want to start with Elbaf here, because I mean, if Birka shares the same name as an important real-life trading city, Elbaf had to trade something with them, right? And I suppose that it is possible Harold didn't really want much of anything, kind of like with King Neptune and the Fishmen. They could have just all been best friends. But there was one resource that we saw earlier in the Elbaf arc that I just kept on coming back to as something they could have easily gotten from Birka, and that is the Sunstone Painters, those random rocks that create tangible rainbow roads in the sky. A very likely nod to the Bifrost, a Norse legend about a rainbow bridge, because not only do these provide an easy path to the sky, which could be very useful for Birkans who are going up and down from the blue sea, which we've actually seen Haradas do in one of the cover stories, not with the rainbow bridge, but regardless, he went up and down, so maybe the Birkans would have wanted these. But more importantly, if you look at this picture that Oda gave us of Yaruj as a child, he's holding a random stone. And now we have no idea what this stone is right now, but it must signify something that's kind of important if Oda's gonna throw it in there. And as I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, we can likely assume that Yaruj is a Birkan because his wings are styled like a Birkan's, as we saw on the mural, and with Yaruj being a child here, that means that Birka was still around, so this rock likely comes from a time period where he was still on the sky island of Birka. So on a base level, it could just be something simple, like it could just be an actual normal rock, which would actually signify the importance of Verth to the Sky People, which we learned about in Skypiea, or it could even be a moon rock since the Birkans are from there, or even like a meteorite just because it's from space, which still kind of fits the theme, right? But I kept on coming back to Sunstone because we also saw something in Skypiea called a Sky Cloud Quarry, which is where they procured mass amounts of sky clouds. But usually a quarry is where you're gonna mine some kind of stone, right? Which could maybe be a small hint that Birka had their own kind of quarry, but a different one obviously. But what is interesting about that is that we also learned that sky clouds have something called pyrobloin in them, which is also a component in sea stone. And I don't think it would be that surprising if sea stone and sunstone were connected in some sort of way, almost like derivatives of the same thing, right? Now, I'm not sure if there's going to be other stones that we're going to learn about, like we're kind of in Pokemon territory with a moonstone that we talked about, or a dawnstone, which would be fitting, or any of the other kind of elemental ones. But even sunstone is kind of interesting, because if we go back to Vegapunk and all the connections I laid out that he might have to Birka, or that he definitely does have to Birka, at least the moon one, well, he's the one who figured out how to kind of work with sea stone to a point that he could coat the world government ships so they could go over the calm belt. So maybe Birka, which again could be a very highly advanced kingdom, maybe even more than Vegapunk, could have figured out how to use sunstone even, and maybe that's where Elbaf got it from. Which then takes us to the government's potential role in all of this. What would they have wanted from Birka in exchange for becoming an ally? Well, they probably wanted weapons, and specifically high-tech weapons, which is a theme that we have seen many times before, with Vegapunk being the most obvious one. But even for centuries now, we've known that the world government has tried to gigantify children. We know they've been interested in weapons of mass destruction, like with the Pluton blueprints, or even Caesar's Shi no Kuni gas bomb, and they even sent CP0 to Wano to procure weapons from Orochi and Kaido. So they will totally work with you if you can provide them some advanced weaponry. And like I said, Vegapunk is the best example of all for this, whether that be because of the Mother Flame, which York obviously had a hand in, but regardless it fits, or even the other weapons the government has used. I mean, Funkfried was a Vegapunk creation, the Sea Stone ships were a Vegapunk creation, Dragon 13 from Punk Hazard was a Vegapunk creation. All of this is very well documented, so I'm thinking that, much like Vegapunk, who parallels the Ancient Kingdom on his own, Birka was able to offer some very powerful technology, and the world government wanted to use it for themselves. And this might even tie to the supposed ancient weapon that destroyed Lulusia. What if Birka built them that weapon, sort of like Enel had the Skypian army build him the Ark Maxim? I mean, that hole at Lulusia looked pretty much identical to the one that Enel made in the White Sea. And maybe that Lulusia weapon could have even played a role in why Birka doesn't exist now either. What if Birka was basically the test run? In fact, even if Enel was ultimately responsible for all of this, we already kind of know that it had to be more than just him raging and using his own lightning one day, because in Skypiea, he was using the Ark Maxim as like an amplifier for his powers to blow up Skypiea with an attack called Rygo. He probably couldn't have done it all on his own. And this is important because his Ark Maxim was made after Birka was destroyed. So if he did destroy Birka, he probably would have needed a different amplifier of sorts. And again, we saw another Ark Maxim in the past on the Elbaf mural, which tells us automatically that they can be duplicated already. So perhaps Birka just had the OG one lying around, or maybe they did just build a third one for the government, but Enel used it to destroy Birka instead. Or at the very least, they might have had blueprints or some kind of intel on what the original was like, which would mirror the Pluton situation a lot, honestly, another ancient weapon that can destroy islands, because we saw that the Pluton blueprints were passed down through galley law, and the government even attempted to infiltrate or partner with them to get it. So this would probably tie to Uranus in some way then. Although if you ask me, I still have my money on that being Loki and or Ragnir, but since Poseidon has the Noah, maybe Loki needs a Maxim to match that, which would make for like the 500th parallel now between Enel and Loki. But either way, another reason that this would all make a lot of sense is because Birka having one of these Ark Maxim type things would help us explain where Enel got the idea to make his in the first place. I doubt it's just serendipity that his ship operates and looks so similar to the murals. In fact, remember how I said that Birkans were smarter than the average? Well, maybe Enel even helped build the one in Birka, which is why he knew how to fix his in Skypiea so quickly. And he may have even been forced to do so, which ultimately led to why he destroyed Birka and why he removed his wings. Sort of like Harold, who was upset with what his people had done in the past, Enel may have been more so upset with what his people were doing in the present, giving in to these other people that called themselves gods. This could be what gave him the idea in the first place to behave like a god himself, and even make the Skypieans build him the very same ship, especially if the leader of Birka had become a god's knight like Harold, because in Harold's final moments, he said that he had truly started believing himself to be a god. Enel may have just taken after them entirely after being a victim to them originally. And what's really interesting about all of this is that Enel working in tandem with the Ark Maxim, or whatever destroyed Birka, is almost like another version of the Mother Flame and its weapon, because Enel is to the Mother Flame as the Ark Maxim is to the weapon, because Enel is literally lightning. He is a power source all on his own, which we saw very clearly during his trip to the moon because he powered the entire city on, including the automata. And this actually leads me to another potential target that the government was after in Birka, and one that I actually like quite a bit more. What if the government didn't need any kind of ancient weapon, because they already had one? Maybe theirs is something older, like the Ox Lloyd as I brought up in some other videos. And what if instead they were just looking for a power source for that weapon? The exact same thing that we saw recently with the Mother Flame. Maybe Birka was their first attempt at it. And what if Enel's Devil Fruit was supposed to be that power source, but instead he ate it and it foiled their plans? Almost exactly like we saw with Loki, because once he met Ragnir and ate that Devil Fruit, he was able to take down Harold. And I mean, even going back to the moon mural, the reason that the sky races left in the first place is because they ran out of resources. And what resources specifically are they talking about? Probably just power, because otherwise Enel wouldn't have needed to power it back on and bring back those automata right away. It's telling us right there that all they needed was power. So what if the death of the past lightning fruit user is what sunk the moon Birka, but then the reincarnation of that lightning fruit user in Enel is what gave rise to it again? It's like he brought that fruit home almost, but sinking the sky Birkans in the process. But in a very weird way, he could have also been saving the blue planet in the process, because if the government had gotten full access to their ancient weapon any sooner, we'd probably be toast. So again, my goal is not to exonerate Enel here. I'm sure he had some very selfish intentions throughout this entire thing, but I just don't think that he was the greatest evil there. It's kind of like Vegapunk saying that we can't yet judge who was good or evil evil in the Void Century. Birka is almost a primer for that situation. Although, if there was one person who was gonna judge, it would probably be Yarouj. Because if you go look at Yarouj back when he was pulling up to Raijin Island in the post-time skip, an island with lightning strikes everywhere, he frowned. And it's one of the only 2 times that we've ever seen him not smiling. So I think that this was a pretty heavy-handed clue that Yarouj has some sort of PTSD about Enel from Birka due to all the lightning. And I mean, the reason that Yarouj's crew is called the Fallen Monk Pirates is probably because they fell to the Blue Sea after what Enel did. And actually, after seeing Harold technically die to a lightning strike himself, I'm starting to wonder if Enel's powers, and by proxy Loki's powers, are even more important than we think. Because what if the Gods Knights are just weak to it? What if part of the reason that Enel destroyed Birka at all was because that's just how much lightning it took to defeat whatever leader or Gods Knight that had pulled a Herald? And look, when it comes to Loki's attack, there was obviously Conquerors involved there too, and we know that's part of the weakness of the Gods Knights, but it was also definitely a lightning strike. And even leading up to that, Skopper and Shanks were talking about how important it was that Loki would eat the fruit and take down Harold, which is rather peculiar because we also saw recently that Summer's Thorn powers deactivated around the children after Luffy hit him with a lightning-imbued attack, the Booming Dawn Thor rifle. However, his powers didn't deactivate around Robin earlier in the arc when Skopper cut him into several pieces. So I don't know if that's just a coincidence or if Oda's really telling us that lightning is actually the weakness of the Gods Knights. But at the very least, it's making me think that Enel would do a lot better than we initially thought. So what if it's almost like lightning is to the Gods Knights as Sea Stone is to Devil Fruit users? This would also make for a very fun twist to Luffy and Enel, where Luffy was Enel's natural weakness and Enel might be the Gods Knights' natural weakness. And much like how Luffy just showed up one day and ruined Enel's plans for Skypiea because he was the perfect counter, Enel might have shown up and ruined Imu's plans one day for Birka because he's also the perfect counter. It's almost poetic in a way. But remember, the situation with Birka and Enel is also a very clear parallel to the Ancient Kingdom and Imu, where they both destroyed a high-tech civilization. So I think it's important to remember that we also heard that a Sky Knight tried stopping Enel back in Birka, but failed, who I think now could almost be like a stand-in for the Sun God, because Joy Boy, who was the Sun God during the Void Century, tried stopping Imu, who is basically Enel in this scenario, but failed. And who would this Sky Knight be? Well, as I mentioned in my last video on this, I think that's gotta be my boy Yarouj, which would mean that he and Enel were enemies, thus explaining his reaction to Raijin Island. And I really love Yarouj being a stand-in for the Sun God here because, first off, he's a priest, much like Kuma, which already screams a bunch of potential Nika-related connections, and second, he smiles all the time, which we know people like Roger, Odin, and Luffy did prior to their executions, even though Luffy survived, obviously. But the parallel between the Ancient Kingdom and Birka that interests me the most is what it could tell us about Enel and Imu in terms of their younger years, like what led them to become the way that they are now. Because if we knew about just one of them, we could maybe try reading a little bit into the other. However, up until this point at least, Oda hasn't even drawn an image of Enel as a child, despite him doing it for almost everyone else, it feels like. We even have an image of Baby King, who's a Lunarian, which hints that they could be from the moon, but we haven't seen Enel's, who's a much older character and we know has ties to the moon for sure. And I think this is probably because if we did have this picture of Enel, we could probably read into it a little bit, which would not only tell us a lot about what happened in Birka, but maybe also a little bit about what Imu was like. Because we already know that Imu was one of the original 20 kings, so they should have been royalty, which could maybe explain why they act like a god, but what were they really like at first? Like, did they become royalty through a normal way, like through their family, or did they get that position through some underhanded means, similar to like a Wapol, a Stelly, or even a Kaido? We've seen this time and time and time again throughout the story. And if you were to ask me, because again, we don't really have a whole lot to go off of here, I think in both cases, it would make a lot more sense for Enel and Imu to have started off like as poor, desolate people who were being harmed by the system at large, and that kind of put a chip on their shoulder to take the whole thing down and become the leader. I think that's a little bit more appealing than like a Doflamingo situation where they were kind of born into royalty and they were always snot-nosed brats, because this would also show us kind of the downsides to these advanced societies, and and part of why they ultimately fail. And for Enel specifically, if it really was the case that Birka joined the world government after he was born, then he'd have grown up in the version of Birka that paid the celestial tribute. So his whole life could have been really affected by that decision. And that would also give him a reason to dislike the world government in particular. And like I mentioned, if he was poor, he could have been even forced to build some of their weapons, which would give him not only the know-how on how to use or stop them, but it would also tell him the simple fact that his country planned to use these things, and it might be kind of smart to stop them. I think it would sort of fit perfectly. And like I said, I wouldn't be that surprised either if Enel and Emu kind of grew up like Doflamingo, so that's where their god complex came from. But I think them being poor and then rising all the way to the very top later, almost like a true rag to riches story, is the best of both worlds. And then before we wrap it up here, I do have one last layer to this whole theory that I wanted to include somewhere, but I couldn't find a good place for it, so I figured I'd just throw it here at the end for some good food for thought. But I do think this is kind of important, because the word Birka can apparently be translated to the word birch, as in a birch tree. And that's oddly sort of fitting because both Elbaf and the Sky Islands have been pretty tree focused. Obviously Elbaf has the Adam tree, which might even provide a pathway to the sky as we talked about, but Skypiea also had Giant Jack, and Shandora had the sacred trees that supposedly held the souls of their ancestors. And then you add in the fact that the Eve tree is right above Fishman Island, who was friendly with Elbaf, and it's likely also right below the world government, who allied with Elbaf at some point. And so I think the main takeaway here is just that Tree Peace is almost upon us, whatever Tree Peace is. I don't know if this means that Birka had their own special trees. Maybe the idea behind souls hiding in trees is more legit than we think, and that's why a tree has a human name here on this island. Or maybe we're gonna learn that Birka was just on top of a different Adam tree. Maybe a birch version of it, because we did learn that there are multiple Adam trees out there. So like I said, I'm not sure where this is going exactly, but Tree Peace is real. And that is it for this video now, guys, so thank you so much for watching. Make sure you guys drop a like before we get out of here if you enjoyed it, and let me know down below what you guys thought about this theory. I feel like there was quite a bit to it and a lot of different moving parts that I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, maybe some holes that you guys could fill. So please let me know down below if you have anything to add. But most importantly, guys, please stay safe out there, and until next time, later.